Okay, talk about the second 100 days. This is Leuchtenburg, fifth lecture, chapter 7, second 100 days. So second 100 days is the summer of 1935, and it's another emergency session. It's called the second 100 days. Unlike the first, which lasted exactly 100 days, depending on when you count, it's lasted either 73 days or 234 days. Now, how can that be? So the regular scheduled session for 1935 begins in January. And as it was approaching the end, abruptly, Franklin Delano Roosevelt issued a call for another emergency session in which he said that the Congress had to stay and deal with some new legislation that he called some must legislation. We'll talk about those 5 musts in a second. But first, let's talk about how this came to be. So this is still his first term. 1935 is the summer before the electoral year of 1936, which FDR will be running for re-election. So this is after the first 100 days, after the midterm elections, but before his re-election. So this is summer of 1935. And there was a court ruling, Supreme Court ruling, that Franklin Delano Roosevelt was upset about. So this needs some background. So the Supreme Court is made up of 9 members who are appointed by the president and ratified by the Senate, which means that different presidents have appointed different people to the court, and the term on the court is until you die, are declared mentally and physically incapacitated or physically incapacitated. You are convicted of treason or you resign. So the court position is a lifetime appointment. So within the court, just like there is in the political world, there is a spectrum of opinions. Right? Some members of the court are more liberal, some members of the court are more conservative. There's a saying that all Supreme Court rulings are equal, but some Supreme Court rulings are more equal than others. Now, what does that mean? If a court rules 5-4 that something is unconstitutional, then it is unconstitutional. It is thrown out. The same is true if it's 6-3, 7-2, 8-1, and 9-0. In one way, none of those things change depending on how big the majority is on the court ruling. But there's a world of difference between a 5-4 ruling and a 9-0 ruling. A 5-4 ruling means that at least 4 members of the court thought this rule was constitutional. So that holds the opportunity in the future that maybe if there's a change on the court, a similar case may rule in a different way. So 5-4 rulings throw something out, but they don't carry, let's say, the same consequential weight as a 9-0 ones. So there was the New Deal case that goes before the Supreme Court. It's one of the first new pieces of New Deal legislation that goes before the court, and it's known as the Schechter sick chicken case. And so this case has a story. So the NRA legislation created codes that dictate the standards that certain operations in the economic sector have to meet, whether it's steel making, whether it's dog grooming, or in this case, whether or not you're a chicken seller. The Schechter brothers were what were known as chicken jobbers, meaning they sold chickens. And they sold chickens, I want to say the Bronx, but it might have been Brooklyn. I always forget which one it is. So let's say it's the Bronx. So they're chicken jobbers in the Bronx, and they sell their chickens. Now, they only sell them in the city. They don't cross state lines. If somebody takes their chicken elsewhere, they take their chicken elsewhere, but they only sell in the city. So somebody purchased some sick chickens from the Schechter brothers, and they were distraught, and they filed a complaint. And the complaint was validated by the NRA code ruling board, who said these chickens were not up to code. So they took away the Blue Eagle from the Schechter brothers. The Schechter brothers sued because they were saying that this is illegal to punish them by federal legislation that created the NRA codes because they don't cross state lines in their sales. So they argued that the federal government should have no say in how they go about their business in terms of code sharing, in which case this would throw out the NRA legislation, right? So when the court rules that something is unconstitutional, it throws out the entire law, right? So the Schechter brothers took this case. They were actually funded by some larger corporations who wanted to challenge this NRA law but didn't want to do it directly. So they used the Schechter brothers as a convenient vehicle, and the Supreme Court took up the case. And the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the Schechter brothers that the federal government had no authority to create rules for companies that don't do interstate commerce. So the NRA codes are unconstitutional. And so they pitched out the NRA codes, right? This whole big piece of legislation that was passed. And it was ruled 9-0 by the court, meaning the most liberal member of the court thought this was unconstitutional and the most conservative member of the court thought this was unconstitutional. They all said it was unconstitutional. And so what is distressing for Roosevelt is this is the first real major piece of New Deal legislation that has gone before the Supreme Court. Right, so the NRA is ruled unconstitutional, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt is galvanized to take action because he thinks this threatens all of this New Deal legislation that he's not only has proposed, but what he's proposing in the future. Right, so in 1935, he abruptly says we need to extend this session and calls for a second emergency session, known as the second 100 days. In this second 100 days, Franklin Delano Roosevelt turns on business. The first 100 days were very solicitous of business input. No place more clearly than with the NRA codes. So Roosevelt decides after this Supreme Court ruling that he's no longer going to curry favor because he doesn't think he's gotten anything out of it. In the 1934 election, although Franklin Delano Roosevelt had worked hard to cultivate goodwill with the business community, in the 1934 election, the business community overwhelmingly supported Republicans. So Franklin Delano Roosevelt says, what am I getting out of it? So he is no longer as concerned, right? You can also use a little bit of our political thinking caps here as well. A lot of radicals have been elected in the midterm election, 1934, and none of them are very interested in being kind to business, right? So Franklin Delano Roosevelt also understands that his party is shifting further left, which will put them at odds with business interest. So he's not getting anything out of it, and the bulk of his party is thinking about more radical regulation and restrictions placed on business. So he's inclined to go along. I'll give you another political statement. So there's a saying in politics that when you see a parade of people, get in front of it, because then people will think you're leading it, right? So Franklin Delano Roosevelt sees the political parade moving to more radical solutions to the political left. And so Franklin Delano Roosevelt gets in front of it, right? And so he is no longer going to be as solicitous of the interest of the business sector, right? So he proposes these 5 must legislations. These 5 must legislations are things that he says must be adopted by Congress before they can leave, right? And the first one is Social Security. Now, Social Security was in the works for some period of time. In the mid-1930s, the United States was the sole industrialized nation that didn't have any sort of social security plan for its aged population. Germany had a social security plan, pension plan in place since 1870. Here we are in the mid-1930s, and the United States still does not have that. And Franklin Delano Roosevelt puts his political might behind the passage of a social security program. This is going to create old age pensions, right? So that idea of Social Security is something that was percolating along. Franklin Delano Roosevelt took it and made it his own and worked to get it passed. But Franklin Delano Roosevelt also puts his own stamp on it. Franklin Delano Roosevelt is a masterful politician, right? And so he understands that passing this type of legislation during the Great Depression, a lot of people are going to be in favor of it, including lots of people in Congress. Lots of people in Congress who may not necessarily have agreed with these ideas of creating a government-funded pension plan are willing to do it because of the desperate circumstances of the Great Depression. But he also knows that in future, there may be new Congresses who aren't so keen on this idea. So if it's simple legislation, then it could be overturned, right? So we saw that with the radical Republicans in 1865, or after 1865, when they began to propose constitutional amendments. Well, the Social Security Act is not a constitutional amendment, but Franklin Delano Roosevelt sets up a system of funding that he believes will make it remarkably durable, right? And so here's what he proposes. There's lots of ways you could have funded this. It could be through taxation. It could be through a levy only on business. There's all sorts of ways that you can fund a government pension plan. But Franklin Delano Roosevelt proposes the following. He says, I want to create a fund from workers today and their employers to fund retired people, right? So money comes out of your employer's profits, and money comes out of the individual workers' paychecks. They pay into a fund, the Social Security Fund, designed to provide old age insurance and pension, right? He does this on purpose because he says, if I build a system where the workers feel that they are paying into it, then no future politician will touch it. Because everybody who pays into this system says, I've been paying for 5, 10, 20, 30, 40 years, and now you want to change it, right? Now you want to get rid of it. They won't allow them to do it. It'll make it politically toxic to try and change the old age pensions. And Franklin Delano Roosevelt was precisely right. Social Security is known as the third rail of politics, because if you touch it, you die. The last time there was any serious proposals or a serious proposal to modify Social Security and change it came when George W. Bush, at his State of the Union address, recommended putting the Social Security Fund into the stock market as a privately funded stock option system to remove the government role. When he did so, it was particularly telling. He did it after he was reelected, because George Bush knew that this was going to be incredibly unpopular, right? And he's not going to suffer any political penalty for it because he's now in his second term and he's not running for a third, right? So that's when he proposed it, but he had to propose it to Congress. All those people have to run for a re-election, and they were completely uninterested. So when he gave the State of the Union address, the Republicans all kind of stood up and cheered a little bit, but then it died a very quiet death because nobody wants to mess with people's Social Security pension, because people argue that they've been paying into it. Even if they don't understand how the mechanism works, they know that every paycheck, money comes out of their paycheck for Social Security, and they want to have that same thing. Now, Social Security is kind of a radical change in American politics because this reverses historic notions of individual responsibility, or at least how it is seen by some folks in the political sector, right? So a government retirement program means that you're not responsible for your own retirement, but that's a misunderstanding of what Social Security was then and is today. And it completely ignores the reality of the economic status of people in the Great Depression, and for that matter, today in the days of COVID-19, right? So in the Great Depression, banks went out of business, taking people's savings with them. So people who had worked diligently, putting away money for their retirement, were impoverished because the bank went out of business. That's not their fault, that's the bank's fault. But nonetheless, individual people were punished for it. People who worked hard their entire life, let's say in a steel mill, they didn't have a ton of savings, but they continue to work, and then they're suddenly thrown into unemployment because the economy has crashed. When the economy crashed, they were forced to draw down their savings. So as they get into their retirement years, they have no money put aside. Again, this is not a function of their lack of individual responsibility. It's because of the system itself is out of their control. So this notion of Social Security is a change. It's a radical change, right? So the second 100 days is much more radical in general than the first 100 days, with the 1.5 exceptions we had before, right? So Social Security, Franklin Delano Roosevelt sees this as what's going to be his legacy, and he's absolutely right. And his funding system has remained very durable. That is still how Social Security is funded today. Social Security was envisioned then and is today seen as a floor, right? It's the floor beneath which you cannot sink further into desperate circumstances. It's designed to keep people out of poverty. And people were impoverished in their older years without Social Security. As we have seen, people were paid generally poorly in the laboring class, so they had little opportunity to put money aside. And as you got older and you could not perform the same amount of work, companies were under no obligation to keep you. So the Social Security system provides a floor to prevent people from sinking beneath. It is not, was not then, and is not now designed to be your only source of retirement income, but it's designed to be a floor beneath which it keeps you out of poverty, because we don't want our old people eating cat food. The next piece of legislation that's part of his must is a banking bill. I don't want to go into too much detail about this, but this is another continued effort by the federal government to oversee and control the banking sector. And it creates the federal role in overseeing banks, right? So a banking bill, again, another federal oversight regulatory role over what was formerly this independent sector of banking. Third, public utilities. Public utilities, as we discussed previously with the TVA, they have a natural monopoly. And what was determined was that many of these companies were actually owned by a very small number of people who owned these natural monopolies in a number of places, operating under different corporate headings, under corporate names. But as it turned out, they were all these corporate entities, the ones who delivered power to Wichita and Kansas City and Oklahoma and Tulsa, Oklahoma City and Tulsa and Dallas, right? Instead of them being 3 or 4 different companies supplying them, they were actually one company that supplied them through complex holding arrangements, so that they were natural monopolies in which power in the Midwest was monopolized by one or a small group of people, right? And so the Roosevelt administration says we need to break up these holding companies, right? These small number of companies who have an outsized role in controlling the economic sector, who are rigging the system to benefit themselves. This is a type of trust busting, which sounds a lot like what Teddy Roosevelt and the progressive Republicans were promoting, right? So this is a progressive goal, breaking up public utilities, but it's being proposed here by Franklin Delano Roosevelt as a democratic plan. And we also have the Wagner Labor Act. Wagner Labor Act is designed to deal with the fallout of this NRA decision by the Supreme Court. Because when the Supreme Court threw out the NRA codes as unconstitutional, they threw out the whole law, which included subclause 7A, right? Subclause 7A authorized and protected the rights of workers to unionize, but it didn't really have much of an enforcement mechanism. The only enforcement mechanism is you could take away the blue eagle if companies weren't treating their workers fairly. This is not a terribly powerful method to protect the workers. And in fact, companies got around this right of workers to unionize by forming company unions and forcing workers to join company unions that really weren't unions of workers. They were just company-controlled ways of evading workers from forming their own independent unions. So the Wagner Labor Act is designed to address this void that has opened again. There's no law protecting the rights of workers to unionize. So Wagner, he and his staff had inserted subclause 7A in the NRA codes previously, decide they're going to create a new strictly enforced labor rule for the working class in order for them to create unions if they want. So what do? They recreate 7A. So again, 7A authorizes and protects the rights of workers to unionize, but they add to it an enforcement mechanism. And the enforcement mechanism speaks in the language that business understands. It takes money from them, right? And to give action to this enforcement mechanism, they create something known as a National Labor Relations Board. This is a board who's empowered to hear workers' complaints or owners' complaints about their workers, in theory, in which they come before the board and they have a hearing, and the workers present their argument, and the company presents their argument, and then the National Labor Relations Board issues a ruling. If they agree with the workers that they're being mistreated in some way or their union efforts are being thwarted by the company, then they can impose fines on the company, removing the thing that catches business owners' attention, money from their pockets. So by imposing fines, it's recreated 7A, but it gives it a much more powerful enforcement mechanism. I say it's 7A on steroids. Right? The final 5 must legislation is something that's known as the Soak the Rich tax bill. Soaking is an early 20th century term meaning to inflict something on individuals. They got a good soaking is how they refer to it. So the Soak the Rich tax bill, as designed, is promulgated that it's going to tax the wealthy at higher taxation rates. It's going to be a graduated taxation rate that's going to strike the wealthy and wealthy corporations with a higher tax rate, right? So this may sound familiar, right? The Soak the Rich tax bill is designed to steal some of the thunder of Huey Long's Share Our Wealth program, but it doesn't propose anything near the level of taxation, confiscatory taxation level that Huey Long is proposing. But this is a tax level that's, with great publicity, is introduced into the Congress, right? Franklin Delano Roosevelt says, here, I put my support behind this bill. It's going to increase the level of taxation on the wealthy to help the poor in the nation. So it goes into the Congress. Now, this again is something useful to know about how politics operates. There's a saying about making legislation that it's like making sausage. Everybody likes to eat sausage, but nobody wants to see it being made. That's what the story is with legislation, right? And so, and this is something that needs a little bit of nuance and understanding what Franklin Delano Roosevelt is doing here. He proposes a tax bill that has a variety of increased taxation levels on the wealthy and corporations. It goes into the Congress with great fanfare. And then when it's out of the public eye, Congress goes about doing the business that Congress does. They start creating loopholes, they do favors for various sets of folks, and what comes out of the end of this process is a tax bill that barely gets the rich a little damp. It's not significantly higher rates of taxation. There's not greatly increased revenue streams that are drawn from this. It's really relatively mild, right? But then Franklin Delano Roosevelt signs this Soak the Rich tax bill with a great flourish and holds it up and says, see, I'm looking out for the little guy too. Franklin Delano Roosevelt knew this bill had changed dramatically because he wasn't too concerned about it. And this is where knowing something about the political power is useful. If Franklin Delano Roosevelt didn't want a comma changed on that bill, they would not have changed a comma on that bill, because Franklin Delano Roosevelt's popularity and political clout was such that nobody would seek to change that bill. But Franklin Delano Roosevelt knew that when he put it into the Congress, Congress would chip away so that what went in very dramatically as an increased taxation rate would come out of the other side of Congress as a not very greatly changed taxation rate. Franklin Delano Roosevelt signed that bill with a flourish, giving the impression that he had dramatically increased rates of taxation, but he did not. So these 5 must legislations, they're all much more radical than the first 100 days legislation. They are decidedly not business friendly, right? So even if it's not as great as they said it were, they still increase the taxation rates on these companies. So things are different, but Franklin Delano Roosevelt is fundamentally not interested in radically changing the system. What he's actually doing is imposing a welfare system on top of a capitalist foundation. It's designed to create a safety net to fix the problems of unrestrained capitalism that was ravaging the public. He doesn't want to turn it into a socialist state or a communist state or a radical state. What he wants to do is make sure the system continues to function, but to sandpaper down some of the hard edges, which are greatly impacting the people. All right, second 100 days. Now we're through the summer of 1935, and our next thing on the docket will be some foreign issues, and then we will be talking about elections going forward.